Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for July 15th, 2014. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures to cyber threats. Today I'm joined by Matt Kaiser. And Matt, how are you doing this week?
Pretty good. Being pulled in all sorts of different directions, but that's pretty usual for me.
Yeah, well, that's the security lifestyle, right? Yeah. It's always something new and when you least expect it. Also joined here by John Hogoboom. And how about you, John?
Same thing, just keeping my head above water.
Keeping your head above water.
Trying.
So we're all keeping busy. That's a pretty clear sign. And Jim Clausing online here. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I'm working on some enhancements for one of our analysis environments, but keeping busy.
Okay, very good. And I'm Brian Rexroad, and happy to have you with us today. First thing we're going to talk about here today is, I guess researchers have been taking a look at password wallets. And Jim, what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, there's been a lot of attention to a paper that's going to be presented next month at a security conference by a couple of researchers at UC Berkeley. I think it's Berkeley. Mm-hmm. And they looked at four popular password managers and found some issues with them. And a lot of the stories have been making this out to, oh, panic, the sky is falling, password managers are no good. And that's not really what I take away from reading the paper. But they looked at four of these password managers, web-based password managers. Only one of them was one that I was really familiar with, and that was LastPass. Mm-hmm. That actually happens to be one I use for my personal stuff at home. But they also looked at RoboForm, My1Login, PasswordBox, Need My Password. And basically what they found is that there were a couple of issues. One with one of the big ones that that a lot of these stories are highlighting is with the bookmarklet feature of LastPass, which basically allows you to have LastPass automatically log you in to websites, and specifically in web browsers that you can't integrate it in another way. That's an issue. It was fixed almost immediately after they were informed. The folks at LastPass were informed of the vulnerability in 2013, so it hasn't been a problem since September of last year. Another one of their vulnerabilities that they found, and they seem to spend a lot of time talking about LastPass, since that seems to me to be the most popular of the ones they looked at. The other one was a cross-site request forgery issue, and this one could actually be kind of a big deal if you use LastPass's one-time password function. Basically, this would make it possible to steal your encrypted password vault, and then they could try to hack that offline. There are ways to protect yourself against some of these things. 4 of the 5 folks fixed the vulnerabilities immediately after they heard about them. The other one, the researchers hadn't heard back from. It's not going to get me to stop using these, because I just have too many passwords to try to keep in my mind, and this allows me a software product that I can use to generate secure, strong passwords and keep them encrypted. I turn on the 2-factor authentication to even get into my password vault, so that is an additional level of security. But one of the things that this really brings up is this is another piece of software. Software is going to have bugs. It is not, if you integrate it in with other things, if you use it directly in your browser then potentially there are ways going through the browser to get at it. One of the nice things about the two password vaults that I use, though, is they're separate applications. The way I use them, they're separate applications, and I either cut and paste or have it up on my mobile device, my phone, and I with my eyeballs copy it, read it and type it in on the keyboard. So I still think password vaults are a good thing, and it really didn't talk about, and I don't know whether they tried to attack any of the other real popular ones like KeePass and 1Password and those. So there are still good options out there. I definitely wouldn't use these stories to scare me off from using the password managers. Just remember, they are themselves pieces of software. They could potentially have vulnerabilities and bugs just like any other piece of software.
Yeah, I think all your points are very good, Jim. I think as a practical matter. So let's dig into this just a little bit more here. First of all, can you help us distinguish a little bit about, you used the term password vault, and in this case we're talking about web-based password managers, and then I guess there are probably some other options here that are worth considering. For example, federated access control mechanisms. Can you help us distinguish between the three a little bit?
You have a federated access. You've got kind of a single sign-on thing where you have the control is managed at some other party, and you authenticate to this other party, and they pass either the credentials back to you to pass on, or they talk directly to the other system. These web-based password managers that they talk about in this particular paper are basically password managers where they keep your passwords encrypted out on some website so that you can access them from multiple devices, from your phone, from
right.
your laptop, from your desktop, whatever. What was the third one you were asking about?
I guess you mentioned password vault. I tend to equate that with something that perhaps you're using locally, but perhaps you have a different definition for it. But I think the notion of making the distinction between the three.
Like a local application.
Right.
So yeah, password vault could be something that's only kept on one device, kept locally, not accessible from multiple machines.
Right, and okay. So I think the significance there is each one of those are really sort of a distinct solution, all sort of trying to achieve the same purpose, but how they go about is a little different, and to the extent that you might have to do some manual operations to be able to, so for example, federated, you're only going to be able to work with organizations that have federated with that. So if you have a Google Plus password, for example, it's going to only work with organizations that have federated with Google, whereas this password, the web-based managers, as you mentioned earlier, give you the opportunity to synchronize between different devices, and but it is a web-based solution, and as you pointed out, it would have its own set of potential flaws associated with it. Whereas when I think of a password vault, it's something a little bit local. You're probably going to have to go through some additional manual steps to use it. And each of them have trade-offs, and I think you made a very good point. Just philosophically speaking, and this is philosophical, sort of the idealistic sense, adding software to any solution cannot inherently make it more secure. It certainly can make it more convenient. It can make it less prone to errors. It can give you more insight into things that you perhaps wouldn't otherwise know about. But underlying inside there, adding software introduces bugs, and fundamentally there are going to be flaws associated with that, with those solutions. But it's a matter of I guess balancing between sort of the philosophical security solution versus a more practical that might actually be helpful and better from a security standpoint. First of all, the fact that these researchers are looking at this, identifying some flaws, helping to isolate those and fix it, that's a good thing. It helps to reduce the number of flaws that are there, and to the extent that we can improve the quality of software and the development of tools like this, that certainly will be helpful going forward. So speaking of quality of software, I guess there's an advertisement out that suggests some higher quality malware.
Sure, I hesitate to call any malware anything but bad software in the first place. But yeah, there was an article, Trusteer mentioned that they saw a posting on an underground forum, they didn't say which or by who, stating that there's a new malware family being sold called Kronos. And if those of you who are students of Greek mythology will know that Kronos is the father of Zeus, and there's a little joke in there somewhere, I'm sure. But this is another of your banking Trojan type malware. It has a bunch of advanced features, apparently, and I'll get back to that. Sandbox bypass, AV bypass, encrypted command and control. So it seems to be fairly sophisticated according to the advertisement. It comes with a $7,000 price tag. $1,000 to do sort of a test run. They set up a server and you play with it for a little while, get your feet wet sort of thing. But that's all we know so far. We have this original advertisement in Russian with an English translation. And there's been lots of speculation on the web as to, wow, is this a Zeus killer? Is this the next new wave?
Right.
And to me, it feels more like hype, honestly, because no one, as far as I know, no one in the good guy community has seen this yet.
Right.
So as far as we know, it doesn't exist.
Although I've heard somebody, I'm not sure who it was, said they took a look at the code, and it has a lot of functions and source code that resembles Carburp. So it might be an offshoot of the Carburp family.
So is this not the same as ZBurp? Because I've heard of ZBurp, which is a Zeus Carburp hybrid that came out at some point.
I don't know I'm not sure if it's a hybrid but they said there were some functions in there that looked very Carburp-like.
Okay, interesting.
But like you said, myself, I haven't actually seen a sample of this yet. I'd like to kind of get a better feel for what it looks like and how it behaves, especially from a network standpoint. Up until now, we're not really sure, other than some hearsay and people advertising it in the underground.
Well, I think just the conversation you just had here is a very valuable one, in the sense that one of the things we've been saying is that there's very little revolution in malicious activity, and I think this is a pretty good example here, where even this new advertised thing is suggesting, it's looking like it's perhaps a derivative and perhaps improvements or subtle, maybe more aggressive in some cases, but improvements on something that already exists. Now, obviously, we're speculating a little bit here, but obviously it's not going to be completely different.
It's rare that there's revolutionary change in malware, and sometimes when we have seen that, that's been really special, like APT type things, like Flame and things like that, where it was somebody off on the side working independently that came up with something completely new. Versus a lot of this crimeware seems to be very iterative, for the most part.
Okay.
So
Matt, what else have you been hearing about this?
Oh, that's basically everything. The $7,000 price tag I originally thought was fairly high, but apparently, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, there was another family that recently sold somewhere in the $10,000 to $15,000, that's US dollars range. So it's not unreasonable, but it is a bit high, in my opinion, for a family of malware that is, as far as I can tell, untested. And again, we've got sort of competing stories here as to what it actually truly is. But whatever its lineage is, I think, is the more important part. Is it good code? Is it, if it is originally Zeus or Carburp, maybe that speaks to the quality of the code. But also, whoever's advertising it on the underground, if they have their own reputation to go along with it and say, hey, I've been here for X number of years, you know who I am and the quality of my product, that also allows them to sell at that rate.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the challenges. Is if you're coming out with a new brand name, in effect, do you really have a market? Do you have a really brand recognition, and in this kind of community, there needs to be a certain amount of trust associated with it, because part of the objective here is to be able to run this in an environment, not be detected, to be able to be successful doing things in some fairly complex ways. So. Developing some trust here is important. I mean, obviously, these people are going to be developing or dependent on that trust to help hide from their criminal activities, right?
To hide from law enforcement, certainly.
Right. So that's an aspect of this, that it's probably not enough just to have a good product. You have to have a reputation and perhaps a stake in the game to some extent.
Certainly.
Right. All right. Well, it's certainly good information to know about, hopefully in advance of actually having to experience this problem, and we hope that it doesn't turn into fruition in the long run here. So next item here, I guess we were talking about this earlier. I kind of equated this to going into a restaurant and then using somebody else's used napkin or something along those lines. But
right. So Brian Krebs, he put an article out recently, and actually it's kind of in response to the NCIC, which is the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, as well as the, I believe it was the Secret Service.
Yes.
Released a bulletin saying that they've recently performed some arrests in northern Texas around some actors who had been putting Keylogger software on hotel computers. So you know when you go to these hotels, sometimes they have these courtesy computers in some kind of business center in the hotel, and I guess they rounded up a ring of guys or whoever, gals possibly too, involved in putting keylogging software on there, using that to harvest login IDs and passwords and other types of things, and then using that to engage in criminal activity. They also noted that in some cases these actors, and this is probably how they tracked them down, they had used credit cards fraudulently to register hotel rooms so they could get access to the network and whatnot without raising suspicion maybe as readily as just walking in cold into the business center there. So I think we all know, for the most part, if you're watching this program, most people are pretty security savvy that you would be very suspicious, or you should be very wary about using any type of machine that you don't have physical access or control of at all times. Even when I use other people's machines that I know, I'm a little suspicious, but maybe we're a little bit more paranoid than most people. The other thing is this is not like the only type of threat that we've seen in the past. There's been hardware keyloggers that people have used. There was a case a few years ago at a library, another center where there's public computers, where they had put the hardware keyloggers in between the keyboard and the USB, which is another method that's very hard to detect unless you're visually checking the machines when you got to use them. And we've also heard stories about even in hotels where there's those rogue DHCP. A little bit different, but they can kind of do man-in-the-middle type of injection on your network connectivity using the hotel network. Anyway, one of the things I thought was interesting, besides the whole article in general, and one of these things you want to be aware of and be conscientious of when you're at a hotel, and I would recommend, don't use a hotel computer. Use your own if you can at all possible. And if you do have to use one, try to minimize your the ability for somebody to leverage something there. So if you have, if you have a file or an email you want to look at, maybe send it to one of those temporary throwaway email services from your phone, and then bring it up on the hotel computer. So that's the only thing that you'd be able to get is that one email at this temporary email, and then print it, or if that's what you need to do, like maybe your flight or something. Boarding passes, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But Brian Krebs also referenced one of these articles from Microsoft, which I thought was interesting because I hadn't seen this before. But they had posted probably a while back their 10 immutable laws of security, which I thought was interesting. And he referenced that number 3 is the one we're kind of talking about here. We have it up on the screen. If a bad guy has unrestricted physical access to your computer, it's not your computer anymore. So basically saying, don't trust a machine that you don't have physical access to at all times, because that's one of the main tenets of, if you can physically access a machine, it's basically game over. There's really no way to protect a device if somebody has physical access to it, because there's so many different ways to take control of that device, without just having to type on a keyboard. You could replace hard drives, you could copy, you could do all kinds of things if you have physical access.
Well, it is conceivably possible, and particularly under certain circumstances. Take a look at a bank or some file cabinets. They're designed to protect against physical access, but there's a time associated with that, and there are circumstances associated with that. And the intent in most cases where you're trying to protect things from physical intrusion, the intent is to just buy some time so that the authorities can get there, so that they can be detected, or at least when you come back you realize that it's been physically modified. I have not seen very many computers that have any sort of physical tamper protection. So
Right.
I'm trying to reinforce your point here, in that absolutely, if somebody has physical access to your computer,
And even things that do, like an ATM, we've seen lots of cases where skimmers can be added right onto it because they have physical access to the device. There was another story we covered a few weeks ago when Stan was here, where some Russian guys had figured out how to inject a actual printed circuit board into the card reader and take control of the ATM.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you have physical access, there's a lot of things that can be done, especially if you understand how the machine works.
Absolutely,
at
yeah.
a very detailed level.
that's true.
It's
Okay.
interesting. There's a lot of the Internet of Things hacks that are coming out now. A lot of people are assuming the vulnerabilities are inherent because they're attached to the network. But actually, a lot of the really interesting research is people who are buying these things, taking them home, put them on the workbench, ripping information out of the hard-coded chips and finding encryption keys, and then going back and doing it over the network with even more knowledge.
Right.
It's at that point it becomes a real, like, everything connected to the internet is vulnerable, but only because the work has been done against the physical device prior.
Yeah, absolutely true.
Right.
Yeah, good point. Well, I guess what we'll do here is we'll make it a homework assignment for folks to take a closer look at some of these other immutable laws. Certainly, there are 10 of them here. We're showing giving you access to the 10, and it's right off the Microsoft website. So very good things to keep in mind. And I guess one of the things I thought would be worth pointing out, you said don't use a computer that has been in someone else's control or that you haven't had control of from a physical standpoint. I think this will be a good, basically an awareness topic to include as a part of any corporate security program, that is to make sure that it's not just the security savvy folks, but it's the folks in general realize that when they go to another computer, they are taking some risks, and perhaps some advice around those lines. First of all, USB devices shouldn't be plugged into computers that you're not familiar with, unless you plan on throwing it away.
Right.
A CD is much better, particularly if it's a it's a one-time write CD. You can put some data on there. Now, keep in mind what data is going on there. You're basically giving away, but at least you don't have the opportunity for it to get rewritten and then come back and infect your own computer. So things can spread through these computers as well, as something that folks will need to be paying attention to.
I would pay good money to have a nice high-capacity drive with a physical write switch. I have not seen those in so long. I have to go back to like my 256 megabyte old key to do that.
Yeah, the floppies used to always have this.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
They do.
Yeah, they got rid of those, right?
Right.
We used to have Write Protect notches, and you
geez,
put a little
I
piece of
dated
tape
myself
over
again.
on your 5 1/4 inch.
Yeah, put the
disc,
tape
yeah.
over it. The tape would always fall off, and then you end up, whoops, no, that's not so good.
Yeah,
Right.
the USB thumb drives I've seen, they have write protection ones, but like you said, they're very hard to find.
Yeah. Now, these 10 immutable laws are here just in bullet form, but if you go to the Microsoft website, there's a little bit of explanation around all those. And certainly, if you have any questions or comments, or you want to debate this a little bit further, feel free to contact us. We certainly welcome your input. Remember, it's ThreatTraq@list.att.com to contact us through email.
We could probably make one, maybe 2 or 3 shows about debating these topics amongst us, honestly.
And perhaps we will.
We could.
Okay, so next item here, I guess there's a new list. There are new forms of blacklist coming out in different ways. And Matt, can you tell us a little bit about this new one that's come out?
Sure. So abuse.ch has been around for a while. They're most well known for the Zeus tracker list, where they track the different locations of known Zeus command and control. It's been very helpful to us, I know. They've just released a new blacklist. They're calling the SSL Blacklist. And what they're doing is they are publishing the SSL certificate information for known malware command and control. So if you have the ability to detect SSL certificates as they pass across the wire, you can say, almost without a doubt that these certificates are malicious, therefore the traffic they're protecting is malicious, and you can ban them from your network. The list is sort of set up, it's biased towards using Suricata, which is like Snort. It might actually be a fork of Snort at some point.
Yeah, I don't recall, but you're right. It has maybe some basis in that originally.
So it's meant to be used with an IDS that has the ability to look for SSL certificate information.
Okay.
They're actually publishing the SHA-1 hashes of those as well as the a couple bits of metadata that you would look for, like the name of the company,
common name,
exactly,
things like that inside the certificate.
So the list is available online. They've also got a secondary list if you don't have that capability to use. They're actually tracking the IP addresses that they've associated with those same certificates, which is okay if that's all you can really use in your environment. I personally would feel better if I would recommend that you use the actual signatures, because those command and control points are going to change over time. Those IPs might get recycled, they might get cleaned up. But if you're using those actual SSL certs, that's almost 100% certain that what you're looking at is malicious if you find
Well,
it.
presumably in this case, the private key holder of those certificates is the bad guy, right?
Presumably, yes.
And so nobody else theoretically should have it. And so having presented that certificate in an SSL session, it would be a pretty strong indicator that you're talking to a bad guy.
Right. So they're actually collecting for some variants of Zeus, KINS, Shylock, and I want to say ThreatTraq is the other one.
Okay.
And I expect personally the list to expand in different families as they continue this. It's been out for less than like 24 hours at this point. So I'm sure they'll work on it.
Okay.
And to your point of IPs changing a lot, I did check probably like the most recent 20. None of them are still up. So, because I was trying to go grab the certificates, to maybe try to figure out if I could do something with our own detection stuff to look for the presence of these certificates, other than the SHA-1 sums.
So a lot of them have been taken down, but they may have migrated to different servers.
They may have
or
migrated
might show up in
someplace
different
else.
places.
And the thing to keep in mind, the common name or whatever the domain name is that's listed in the certificate, there might not even be one in many of them, doesn't necessarily indicate the domain that they're using to resolve to go get to that, command and control. So it appears that the ones that are on the list, as far as I was able to determine, are not alive anymore, not up. And they probably moved someplace else, but I'm not quite sure where they've moved to.
Okay.
But irrespective, they could still reuse those certificates anywhere, because it's not necessarily tied to a specific IP address or anything.
Well, that's the danger of a public blacklist like that, is as soon as it becomes public, it becomes known to the attackers as well. So if they can set something up that says, okay, well, this certificate's no longer any good to us, this one isn't either, they can cycle through. So it's going to be a cat and mouse game, but it's good to at least have these, for the good guys.
We're going to set you up with a couple of questions here. First of all, why not just revoke the certificates?
Well, they're not through like a real certificate authority, so you can't, go to them and get a certificate revocation, list for these. They're self-signed certificates. That's another thing also that you could be looking for in the certificate chain. Is if you have a means to do this, there aren't many appliances that I know of that can do this, but maybe some proxies and whatnot can. Look for, when the certificate comes back, there'll be some kind of certificate signing chain in that certificate, and you can see, well, this is a self-signed one versus one that's signed by VeriSign or someone that's trusted, which might be a tip-off that, hey, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a rogue site necessarily when you see SSL certificate that's self-signed. But it's one of those indicators where all of these, as far as I was able to determine, are self-signed. I don't think any of them were, signed by an official SSL, signer.
Well, we've certainly seen cases where they were signed by a valid authority, but they were expired and perhaps stolen in some cases like that. So there are other scenarios that could exist. I think this is perhaps just in its infancy, and or hopefully the intent is to expand this to other types of certificates used in malicious circumstances going forward. So the next question is, how the heck can you see this if SSL is encrypted? I know you're thinking, why is Brian asking these goofy questions?
Well, you can. I mean, so when you first do the SSL exchange, the first thing that the server is going to send back to you is the public part of the certificate.
Yeah.
So that is actually clear text. It doesn't look clear text on the wire, but certain components of it will be clear text. And that's what your browser actually ingests and says, okay, here's my certificate. This is how I'm going to go encrypt this traffic to the endpoint. And then he uses the private part of the key to decrypt. And then you go back and forth that way. So the very first part of that session setup of your SSL session that is transferred in the clear, if you have an appliance that can recognize that that's happening and maybe save off that certificate, or do some analysis of it, you'd be able to tell, okay, this is one of the ones that's on the list here. It's got the same SHA-1 or maybe the certain components like the common name or the subject, or there's a couple other fields in there that are in this certificate are match whatever they're in there. Although there's a lot of in the list there that are using the defaults. Yep. So when you go to use OpenSSL to create your own certificate, they give you that Internet Widgets PTY something something, and people just hit return, 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 and there's a bunch of certificates like that on the list. So you really need to look at that SHA-1, which would be unique. That would very accurately specify that this is the certificate that they're talking about that you're also seeing.
Okay. So last question here, again, another setup here. Why doesn't the browser just tell me that I've got a bad certificate, it's self-signed? Usually I get that pop-up that says, go ahead, Matt, it's yours.
I'll take this one. John's been taking all the fun ones. Because this isn't a browser. This is malware communicating back and forth. There's no indication to the user that this malware is even installed on the machine, so your browser will not have any way to warn you.
Right.
It's really between the malware and its home that the whole thing.
So that's why it's important that we get into the network in this case. We can't depend on the end computer because it's got some malware installed, and this is actually one mechanism to try to identify that you've got malware on your environment. The fact that that certificate's being being accessed, most likely an indicator that the client side has been infected, and you need to go and remediate that problem.
Yep.
All right, good deal. Okay, so that's
one last thing I would mention about this is that I find it interesting that they're releasing SSL certificates as a indicator, a form of a network observable, which is not very common. I know Mandiant has done this with the APT1 report, but it's not a very common indicator. And this is probably the first mainstream one that I've really seen, publicly, that's going to be refreshed on a regular basis. And I think it's interesting in that, I think we struggle, and probably other people struggle, in collecting indicator data and figure out how do I ingest this into some kind of system that I'm going to keep all of my indicators and observables so that I can push that out to my various devices that are going to look for this and help protect my enterprise and whatnot. Right. So just another hiccup of, I wasn't expecting this. I've been looking for URLs and bad email senders, and those types of things are pretty commonplace in terms of indicator data, but SSL certificates haven't. So now some people are going to have to retool and think, okay, I got to figure out how I'm going to store this in my database and things like that. So just another thing.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something you can go to your, if you have an IDS vendor that you're working with, to talk with them about, or if you have a proxy on your interface to your enterprise, you can talk to your vendor that provides your proxy tools, and the onus is on them to really make this information useful in many cases. Right. All right. Okay, so let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here, and the first item here is scam probes on port 1521 TCP. That port is associated with, it's actually the default port for Oracle SQL database, and Oracle has a lot of products now. MySQL is actually a product owned by Oracle as well. This is not the MySQL database, it's the sort of what we consider the traditional SQL database platform. But in any case, we're looking at 30 days of data here, and what we're seeing is, I guess over the last week or so, a little bit more, perhaps the last 2 weeks at a lower level, some scanning activity, and I guess my guess here is that this is anticipatory toward an announcement from Oracle. They have their regular quarterly critical patch advisories that come out, and there's one scheduled for July 15th, which happens to be today as we're recording this program. Now, there was a pre-release that was announced, and in there I did quote, one of these vulnerabilities may be remotely exploitable without authentication. So that suggests perhaps that there's somebody going out looking for perhaps Oracle SQL databases that are accessible with the intent of perhaps trying to exploit this vulnerability. So certainly if you're running an Oracle database, you're going to pay attention to that, make sure that it's not internet accessible, and in fact, even in your enterprise, you might want to be looking for any indications of attempts to try to access those databases in an unauthorized manner.
We see 1521 get scanned just about at the time that these patches come out every quarter, and as you said, today is the day that Oracle's scheduled to release those patches. I haven't seen them yet, but they're patching 113 vulnerabilities across all of their products, and the highest CVSS scores were the Oracle database and Java, and then MySQL was a little further down the list. So, I think you're right. I think this is probably in anticipation of that vulnerability that they mentioned would be exploitable without authentication. Folks are trying to figure out which servers might be vulnerable before they can reverse engineer the patch and figure out what the vulnerability was.
Right. And we shouldn't rule out the possibility that some of the scanning was actually, with good intent associated with it. But I will point out that most of this activity is actually from a very small number of sources in China. It would be hard to rationalize that in scanning a good portion of the internet from China and scanning across the United States would be an indication of good intent, but perhaps it is. Next item here, scan sources on port 443 TCP. We've been reporting on this for a while. I just wanted to give a little quick update. No degradation or reduction in activity associated with this. Most of these sources, the vast majority of them, are from Argentina, although they are not the primary source of probes. There are actually two sources that are the primary sources of probes. One being basically a university that's doing research activity, and then some activity that's from China, and they're working on sort of a different sort of time cycle, not shown in this graph here. I'm showing 90 days of activity here just to sort of point out again, I think we showed this in a previous program, that there were really two episodes of this activity. We're in the second episode of activity that is a large number of sources from Argentina that are doing scanning activity on this port. Next item here is scan probes on port 623 UDP. This is associated with the ASF, that's Alert Standard Format, the Remote Management and Control Protocol. And we've talked about this a little bit before. I'm showing 90 days of activity. And it's a regular probing activity that is, there's probing activity that's kind of recurring on a day-to-day basis. There are some exceptions to that. And again, we're looking at 90 days of data in this particular case, so I could basically show where this activity has started and how that profile has changed. It appears that the primary source of this activity is sort of a research or security research activity. And my guess here is that they're looking at it as a potential reflection or amplification protocol. Again, this is a UDP protocol, so the source address could be spoofed. There may be circumstances where you can solicit a large response from this application on port 623, and that would make it a potential for using it in amplification or reflection attack activities. So based on that, I went and took a look to see if there were any signs or evidence of reflection attacks using this port, and did not find any up to this point. So hopefully we're safe on this matter. I suspect there aren't that many applications that are exposed to the internet that have this, but certainly that's a possibility that there would be.
But here's a good point that this is a remote management protocol.
That's a good point as well, yes, and so the motive may in fact be to gain access to systems that would be remotely manageable and perhaps to
the scanning could
perform other activities.
To identify them.
Right.
It might not be necessarily for reflection, but
yeah, very good point. Next item here is just sort of an update on the zero access botnet, and what we're looking at here is the P2P activity associated with zero access over the last 2 years. Thanks to John for being able to basically go back and assemble this information over the last 2 years and get it available. Now, this botnet's generally been associated with a click fraud activity, and it was disrupted twice. First in I think late July 2013 by Symantec, and then again what we refer to as a takedown, I'm going to call it a disruption at this point, in December 2013. But what we've seen recently over the last, I would say, last 3 weeks or so, are numerous indications from different sources, different circumstances and evidence of activity that suggests that this botnet is active again. We're not so sure that it's doing, or at least not significant amount of recruiting into the botnet itself. As you can see, that the activity recently over the last few months has been, kind of a downward slope, not a whole lot of new members, but we're certainly seeing cases or indications that the botnet, perhaps what is remaining, is being used for, or at least prepared for use in nefarious activities, perhaps resuming that click fraud activity. Taking a look at the top 10 most probed ports. Top of the list we have here is port 22. That hasn't changed since last week. It was the top last week as well. Next item is port 445 TCP, which we typically see on this list. 53 UDP, which has moved up a few slots, actually 7 slots from last week. 3389 TCP, that's remote desktop protocol, followed by port 23 Telnet. Port 443 TCP, we talked about that a little bit already. Port 80 TCP, 1433 TCP, and then followed by 8 TCP, which actually is a ping request, and then not a very strong indicator of what's actually going on there. And then last on this list is port 8080 TCP. Taking a little bit of a closer look, since port 22 TCP was at the top of the list here, we talked about this last week as well, but I thought I'd revisit it because it continues to show sort of a climbing trend. Looking at the last year of activity on port 22, since about November last year, actually the trend line here starts around November 17th or so, and up to present day, it seems like we've seen a significant increase in the activity on this, more than a 5-fold increase, perhaps closer, depending on how you draw the line, closer to about a 10-fold increase in general activity. And in fact, what we're seeing, it's probably a little bit difficult to see in the graphic, but actually some spikes that are what I'll say are new records in terms of probing activity on port 22 over the span of the last 2 years. So something significant to be paying attention to. If you have any SSH exposed on the internet, you're going to want to pay attention to that. Make sure that you're not subject to brute force attacks. And the subtlety here is that your brute force attack could be coming from many different IP addresses. It isn't necessarily just one and then gets locked out. They may be using many different IP addresses to do that attack activity.
And you might not even know the devices that you have that are listening on port 22 for SSH. So there's a lot of these embedded devices, home routers, other types of NAS appliances, network attached storage and whatnot, that you might not even be aware are internet exposed with SSH. So if you're not, you should check.
Yeah, good point. Plan for it. Try to get the firewall as close to the outside edge as possible. And even then, identify your address space, scan it, try to identify services that you didn't expect to be there.
And I left out a big one, which is your DVRs. Your security camera DVRs, which happen to be a lot of the lion's share of these infected devices. People tend to open these up or set them up as like a DMZ machine so that people on the outside can get access to them. So maybe from your phone or whatever, you can go look at your web cameras that you have in your business or your home. And when you do that, sometimes you're inadvertently exposing the SSH port as well.
Yeah, absolutely true. Okay, next item here is top 10 most sources probing, and this is not seen a lot of movement since last week. Top of the list, port 443 TCP. We talked about those primarily sources out of Argentina, followed by port 445 TCP. We're going to take a look at that in a moment here, and then followed by port 23 TCP, 8080 TCP, 80 TCP, and the rest of these here are actually 2 of them are associated with gaming. John, you keep correcting me on this. Port 3128, that was associated with
gaming. That's Squid
it was
Proxy.
Squid Proxy, yes,
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And then followed by port 8081 TCP. So taking a look at, again, the last 2 years of trending activity associated with scanned sources on port 445 TCP, this is primarily associated with the Conficker infection, and it is diminishing somewhat, but not significantly, or not as significantly as we'd like to see. And just to put it into relative terms here, about 2 years ago, we were seeing on the order about 27 million, or excuse me, 27,000 sources they were scanning on this port from our perspective, and this is a specific perspective, and then relatively speaking, we currently see on the order of about 20,000 per hour. And so, again, diminishing, but not as significant as you'd like it to be. Not even to this point where we've seen a third of them go away at this point. So that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ThreatTraq@list.att.com. And you can get notices of new episodes through Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq, and we certainly welcome your feedback there as well. The ThreatTraq video is available in two places on the AT&T Tech channel. It's att.com/ThreatTraq, as well as on the AT&T Tech channel on YouTube. Just search for ThreatTraq and you'll find it there. There's an audio-only version also available on iTunes. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Jim, online, John, and Matt. And I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.